Man has now stopped his hunting and gathering ways. He's beginning to settle in parts of the world and starting agrarian societies. And we begin our art history conversation in one of those regions of the ancient Near East. When we study ancient Near Eastern art and Egyptian art, and then later on art in China, art in the Americas, we have to have that historical contextualization. We're looking at some of the earliest civilizations such as Mesopotamia, Egypt, Indus River, China, the Americas when we talk about the Olmec and Norte Chico. Now if we look at Mesopotamia, Egypt, Indus River Valley, and China, these are our river civilizations. Olmec, Norte Chico, not so much. What we are seeing is that the domestication of wild grains, we're seeing the domestication of animals, and so we really have two societies. We have agricultural societies that are tilling the soil, cultivating the soil, and you have another society that are raising domesticated animals such as the goat, later sheep, cattle, and they're going to create their very distinctive developments. But because of agricultural societies, what we begin to see, and this is important to art history, is the creation of social stratifications that never occurred under hunting and gathering cultures. We see gender inequality being born. We see the role of men, the role of women. We see complex governments created because of agricultural societies. We see people like kings and queens. We see bureaucracies. We see officials. We also understand that trade routes are also being developed. So we see economic systems, and art tells us a little bit about those exchanges and the syncretism that continues with that. We see intellectual developments later on in our early Near Eastern societies when stories are being told, when we have innovations, the inventions of things like the wheelbarrow, the sundial, but also art and architecture too. And finally, complex religions are all parts of these agricultural societies. So when you look at art, when you look at architecture, particularly in our earlier studies, you have to ask yourself, what does this tell me about the social structures of the culture that created this work? Can I see a hierarchy? Does this tell me the difference between the rich and the poor, the peasantry, the very small middle class? Is this work about government? Does it demonstrate kings and queens, nobility? Does it tell me about officials? Is it telling me, or was it created for religious reasons? Because we look at religions early on in polytheistic terms, or monotheistic, or paganism, or shamanism, or ancestor worshiping. When we look at art, is there a story behind that art? What's being told? Was it developed because of something like the Epic of Gilgamesh? But also the economic systems, the trade routes between, say, the Mesopotamian region and the Indus River Valley civilization, and the Mesopotamian region and the Egyptian. And what we have are these exchange of artistic ideas. So the Near East is where we kind of start ourselves, and we begin to see Near East artistic conventions in Egypt. We might even see those in the Indus River Valley. So all this contextualization is very important when we look at early art and architecture. And we're using this sort of structure, social, government, religion, intellectual, economic. How does art tell us a little bit about that? And is art created because of these elements? We begin with the White Temple and its ziggurat. Ziggurats and the temple are two separate elements. You build the ziggurat first, and then you put the temple on top. Ziggurats are huge step structures. This particular one is from the Sumerian culture. The first ziggurats may have developed from the practice of rebuilding at sacred sites. So early ziggurats might have been, I build a small element and then I build on top of it. And we would see that with Mayan culture as well. And whatever the origins of their design, ziggurats tower above the flat plain. And what it tells us is about wealth. It tells us about prestige. It tells us about stability of a city's ruler. And the glorification of the gods. Ziggurats were built, and then a temple was put on top for the tutelary god of that city. So you have Uruk you might have a ziggurat in the city of Ur, and they may be directed at a particular god. So this structure is really built for two reasons: government and religion. Uruk was about a 1,000-acre city, and it marked the first independent city-state, the first independent Sumerian city-state. And there were two large temple complexes. One of those temples was dedicated to the goddess of love and war, Inanna, and the temple platform of Anu, which was built in stages to a height of around 40 feet. And what you have right around 3100 BCE is a whitewashed mud brick temple that archaeologists refer to as the White Temple, and it was erected on top of the platform. But today, as you can tell, it's in its permanent state of ruin, and we would have this sort of simple rectangle with an off-center doorway that led into the large chamber that would have had an altar. Possibly smaller spaces would have opened up to each side. So again, to review, the White Temple glorifies two elements of our early civilizations. One is religion. It's built for religious purposes, for a tutelary god or a goddess, in which you had a priest class that worked within the temple, and every morning they would lay out clothes just in case the god or goddess showed up. They would cook a meal, and they would continue to do this for the rest of their life. And the second thing is, because rituals occurred here, this was also used for government purposes. And so you have this sort of twofold. It is the largest structure in the 1,000-acre city of Uruk. So it's supposed to be seen as, everybody's eyes go to that. So it's an important structure. So what we might have found in temples on top of ziggurats are votive figures. And votive figures were of men and women, images dedicated to the gods, and are directly related to the ancient Near Eastern devotional practices in which individual worshipers, people, could set up images of themselves. So they would go hire an artist to kind of create a votive figure to represent them. These images would be put into a shrine. The artist might put some simple inscription like one who offers prayers, and is sort of a stand-in for the person. Now, the artists followed conventions. Conventions are traditional ways of representing forms that were important to the art style of Sumeria. The figures had stylized faces and bodies. They dressed in clothing that emphasized the pure cylindrical shape. The votive figures stand solemnly. The hands are clasped in respect, almost in a prayer position. Perhaps a posture expected in devotional contexts. The bold and staring eyes that kind of make you a little afraid were a bit contemporary for Sumerians at that time, and they advised their worshippers to approach their gods in an attentive manner, an attentive gaze. The face of the woman from Uruk, she has her arched brow inlaid with a dark shell. That may have once emphasized the huge, wide open stylization of the time. Juxtaposed would be our male figures who were bare-chested, yet they wore some sort of skirt that appeared to be made of maybe sheepskin or goat skin. They are portrayed in a muscular and stocky way. They have heavy legs and they have rather large feet. They have cylindrical bodies, and again, compared to the female figures, which are as massive as the men, but they would have a long sheepskin dress that would reveal just their sturdy legs. Now, contextually, I would say that these votive figures are designed to honor the gods. So this is created for religious reasons, and the size of the votive figure also represents social hierarchy too, meaning that the larger your figure, the more money, the more wealth you have, and the smaller means that you don't have as much money. So there's a bit of a social sort of stratification shown in these works of art if you had several of them put together, but it also shows religious dedication as well. Now, what you'll find in cultures like the Sumerians or the Akkadians or the Babylonians or even the Egyptians is that they left a lot of wealth inside the tombs of former leaders. And here we have an important element. This was found in the tomb of a king. This is the Standard of Ur. There are two sides to the Standard of Ur. At the top of this image, you see the peace side. And what we need to understand is that we have three narratives being told here. And so each narrative is known as a register. The bottom two registers read from left to right, but yet when we get to the top, we read from right to left. We see hierarchy of scale because if we look at the top register of the top image, you'll see that one figure stands above everybody else, and that is the king. That's the person who's most important. That's why this is found in a tomb. So what does the top element tell us? It tells us about that during peace we see fertility, we see great harvest, because we see down on the bottom men bringing harvest probably to market or to pay in taxes. We also see that the domestication of the animal has occurred. We see cattle, we see maybe horses along the way, but yet we still see people carrying things too. At the top register, we have some sort of celebration, some sort of food, because when you're in peace, you get to celebrate. You see all the way to the right, the second guy at the top register, second guy to the right, he's playing the lyre. So they've invented music, they've invented a musical instrument. But yet everybody's eyes are directed on the king that's at the top, and everybody seems to be doing well. But if we compare that to the bottom image, again, we have three registers. We read the bottom two from left to right, and the top from not really so much the right to left. I mean, we could read it that way, but it all comes to the middle. And we still see that hierarchy of scale on the top image. There's our king. He's got his spear. There is his four-wheeled chariot being pulled by domesticated animals, probably the horse. So we see this technology, this warfare implementation. We see in the bottom, this is the war side of the Standard of Ur. We see in the bottom register, we see our chariots being pulled, we see archers, and we also see, if you take a good close look, you see bodies laying down, and the horses are sort of running over the top. The carts are running over the top. The middle register, we see soldiers victorious, and if you look to the right, you'll see the prisoners of war being brought in front of the king. So you have two sides, and this must have been a very benevolent king to have something made of this. We have lapis lazuli, you had bitmu, you have all these precious stones, and this also tells us about the trade routes, because some of this stuff is coming from the Indus River Valley. Some of this is also coming from Egypt. And where is it going? It's going into a tomb. So what do we get from this? This is obviously created for a king, so it can be seen as a governmental work of art. It was also put in a tomb, so is this some sort of innovation? Is this telling us a story about this king? That's a possibility as well. So again, as we look at art, you have to think about the historical contextualization behind it and what does it tell us about these societies. Probably one of the most talked about Babylonian kings was King Hammurabi. And it isn't so much about his rule and what he did, it was because he's the first ruler to create a systematic codification of people's rights, their duties, and as well as punishment. So this is like, you break this law, this is the punishment for your wrongdoing. In most of the laws that were created on this basalt slab, this stele, okay, involved death. The Code of Hammurabi dealt with things like family. It dealt with marriage. It dealt with even building contracts. If a house were to fall on the son of its owner, then the contractor shall have his son put to death. It's just an example of what we might see in this stele. But how do you convince a culture about following these laws? You can't, as a king, say this is what we're going to do. What you do is you say, I got these from a god, Shamash, the sun god. I got this from the god of justice. And so we have to our right rays of sun, or rays rising from Shamash's shoulders as he sits, and he's crowned with that conical horned cap on a throne that doesn't seem to have a back, and he's holding the symbol of power, and Shamash is telling Hammurabi, here are the codes of justice. Now go forth and tell everybody else. Now in this stele you have a prologue, and in this prologue it talks about how Hammurabi is a peacemaker, and he's brought back all these temples, and he publishes these laws, and he has many of these steles placed around his kingdom. Within the inscription, Hammurabi declares that he intends to cause justice to prevail in the land and to destroy the wicked and the evil. In most of the 300 or so entries, I think there were 282 entries in all, and what's interesting is that there's one number that's not found in this code law, 282 laws, is the number 13, because the number 13 was still seen as an evil number, as a bad omen number. And again, we get things that are found in this that we still use today. We see the idea that if you break a law, this will happen to you. So we see things like an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a broken bone for a broken bone. But we also see social inequalities. We see that slavery was prevalent within the Babylonian culture. Now, some of these punishments might have seemed quite excessive even in today, but for Hammurabi, this was groundbreaking. So again, we have a work of art that is tied to religion, but is very, very heavy in government, because it talks about laws, it talks about punishments, and it guides society. Now, right around 1400 BCE, a people known as the Assyrians rose to dominance in northern Mesopotamia. And these are pretty mean people, because they used fear as a way to control the people they took over. So we see by the end of the 9th century, the Assyrians controlled most of Mesopotamia, and by the early 7th century BCE, they had extended their influence as far west as Egypt. And soon afterward, they would succumb to, what we always know about world history, internal weakness and conflict and outside invaders. And by about 600 BCE, their empire had collapsed. But because they used fear, they used art as a way, as propaganda, to create that fear. And one of my most favorite works of art is the Lamassu from the citadel of Sargon II. This work is definitely a government work of art. When people came to visit Sargon II, they would have to wait to see the king in a courtyard. And that functioned also as an open-air audience hall. And once people were granted access to the royal throne room, they would have to pass through a stone gate that's flanked by these sort of guardians. And it was really designed to create fear. These are colossal beings. They're known as the Lamassu. I'm not sure about their height, but they're pretty tall. And what we see here is we're combining the bearded head of a man, the powerful body of a lion, which represents strength, or maybe even a bull, again, strength, the wings of an eagle, which could mean, all seeing and all knowing, and the horned headdress of a god. So is this a face of Sargon? Could be. Is he deifying himself? Is this a piece of propaganda telling the person that's passing through that I'm all powerful, all knowing, all seeing, and I am a god, before you even go in and visit? So again, the Lamassu is a very government motivated piece of art, and we have to kind of look at, are we getting to that point where kings begin to see themselves equivalent to the gods? Right around 515 BCE, as King Darius I took to the throne, starting the Persia homelands, the Persian Empire, he began the construction of Persepolis. It's a Greek name. And Darius would import materials and workers and artisans from all over the empire. He even at times ordered work to be executed in Egypt and transported to his capital, so he's having work done off-site. And in true Assyrian fashion, the imperial complex at Persepolis, we see here in its outline, was set on a platform, a raised platform 40 feet high, and would measure 1,500 by 900 feet, accessible only by a single approach, made of wide, shallow steps that could be ascended not only by foot, but by horseback. And that's pretty impressive. And like Egyptian and city-states, it was laid out on a rectangular grid, and Darius lived to see the completion, this is amazing, to see the completion of only its treasury, the Apendana, the audience hall, and the very small palace for himself. The Apendana set above the rest of the complex on a second terrace. It had open porches on 3 sides and a square hall large enough to hold thousands of people. And Darius, his son, Xerxes I, he would add later on a sprawling palace complex for himself. He would also enlarge the treasury building and began a vast new public reception space, what would be known as the Hall of 100 Columns. The central staircase of Darius's Apendana displays reliefs of animal combats, tiered ranks of officials, and here we have lions attacking bulls on either side of Persian generals. And such animal combats, the themes that are found throughout Near East, emphasize the veracity of the leadership and the veracity of men. The elegant drawing, the balanced composition, the sleek modeling of figures reflect Persia's knowledge of Greek art, and perhaps that sort of exchange, that syncretism that's occurring, and the use of Greek artists might have also kind of played into this. And here Darius holds an audience with his son, if we looked at the image a little bit closer, and they're heirs of Xerxes, and they would listen behind a throne. So again, this work of art, again, is a palace complex. It's created for a king. It's to show his wealth. It's to show his power and opulence. And where are they getting the money from? Taxes. They're getting it from taxes. They're collecting food in the form of tax, and then they're selling that onto the market. And the other thing that we have to think about is that, you know, this tells us about a strong central government is when they can build central complexes like this. And what they do is they tell the workers, if you do this, I will feed you morning, noon, and night, and take care of you that way. So again, here's a work of art created not for religious reasons, but for political reasons. So let's bring this to an end. You know, art and architecture of Near East civilizations, in whether it's Egyptian or early Chinese, we have to understand that how is art, how is architecture connected to social structure? What does it tell us about society? Art is created because of the complex governmental systems, particularly when we talk about burial sites. Art and religion, okay, is that structure being built for religious purposes? Is it being built also for government too? When we talk about art, we want to talk about economic systems and talk about those trade routes and how we're going to find art in different parts of our early civilizations. And we can also say in the intellectuals that is that art being telling us a story? Is it being created because of that story, particularly such works as the Epic of Gilgamesh, or a long poem for the time, written in an art form that we could also discuss as cuneiform. Well, I hope this video helped you out.